welcome back to the, I would say, penultimate session, I think, before we close off this workshop. So this next discussion is on, I think we began discussing this in the last session, on the role of international development organizations, and in particular, a question on the role, particularly for intersectional grant making. So we have our colleagues from the IDRC that are joining online, in particular Erin Tanzi and Jessica Kadeski on the Sustainable and Inclusive Economies program. And also in the room with us, we also have Samantha Nasrallah, who's working on climate resilience and food systems. So Erin will be presenting, and what we're hoping to get is some ideas around the conversations that we've been having over the last 2 days, and more kind of practical recommendations on the role of international, or at least development research funding organizations for integrating intersectionality, or promoting intersectionality, and in particular issues around kind of best practices or and challenges and opportunities at a programmatic level as well. So with that, to kind of introduce Erin Tanzi, as I mentioned, Erin is the Director for Sustainable Inclusive Economies at IDRC. Erin has over 20 years of experience in the international development and humanitarian sectors, working with the Canadian and international non-governmental organizations, the United Nations agencies, and bilateral development programs. She served with the World University Service for Canada in Malawi, CARE Canada, the United Nations Refugee Agency, and the United Nations World Food Programme in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Additionally, Erin worked with the United States Agency for International Development in Pretoria, South Africa. Erin has been involved in various applied research projects and has served as the coordinator of research for the International Organization for Migration's partnership on HIV and mobility in Southern Africa, where she generated new evidence and thought leadership in applied policy. Erin also worked on governance programs with Global Affairs Canada together with the South African government before joining IDRC. Since she joined IDRC in November 2020, Erin has been contributing her expertise to the International Development Research Center as the director of the Sustainable Inclusive Economies Division and a gender equality and inclusion leader, leveraging her extensive background to drive impactful development initiatives. So I'll now hand over to Erin, and then we'll open up to the discussion. And if you have specific questions as well, what we're hoping for is a robust and open discussion when it comes to issues of intersectionality on the ground. Thank you.
Hi there. I don't know, I can't seem to turn on my camera. Oh, there we go. Can you see me? Yes, there we go. Okay. Sawubona, everybody. I really wish I was there with you right now in the warmth where it's nice and sunny, but here I am speaking to you from Ottawa. And it's really an absolute pleasure to be here and to have been able to listen in on some of the extremely interesting sessions over the last 2 days. The time zone difference didn't help us much here in Ottawa. So I was up at 5 in the morning listening to many of you with absolute real pleasure. So and I'm also joined by my colleague, Jessica Kadeski, who's also in Ottawa. I wanted to just frame a little bit. So I think you know IDRC, we are a we are a funding organization that funds research in developing countries, right? We've been around for 50 something years. And some of the things that we have been grappling with in our own center are, of course, issues of gender equality and inclusion within a research context, and how do we systematically ensure that gender equality and inclusion is integrated into all the research that we do, whether it's on climate resilient food systems, whether it's on the care economy, whether it's on animal health, you name it. So in our center, we have something called the Gender Leadership Team. It's just an internal team where Jessica and I actually spend a lot of time thinking about how best to go about giving our program teams the practical knowledge, skills, and tools to be able to ensure this integration. And of course, we're not doing the research ourselves. We're giving the money to research organizations all over the world. And in many, many cases, we are learning from them on the best ways to integrate GEI, right? But in some cases, they are learning from us. So it's a balance. And this issue of this term intersectionality, as I know you know, has been popping up here and there, and what about it? And everybody got all excited. And of course, you go back to the literature and you know that it's coming from the Black feminist movement in the United States. Does this apply to us? Should we be integrating this kind of terminology into the work that we do? And round we would sort of go. And that's where we decided, I mean, the center decided to do some of our own research, to our own kind of reflection on how well our projects that we fund are actually integrating an intersectional approach or not. And so you're going to be hearing, some of these case studies. And, I think the richness of the discussion that I've heard so far is that, some are saying, well, we use an intersectional approach, we just don't use that language. We always think about caste. We always think about ethnicity. We always think about, and that's fantastic. I think that some of the takeaways that we that I think Ariane Dahan, who's not, I don't think he's on the call right now, but he's been working very closely on this work with FITS. One of the things that I think stuck out for me is that let me see here. I think I've actually written down the recommendation about intersectionality in grant making. So this is the recommendation. It's to resist the uncritical adoption of intersectionality and scrutinize its implications for internal processes and power dynamics. So IDRC should consider developing principles for the integration of intersectionality throughout the grant-making cycle that emphasizes local context, flexibility, and a commitment to addressing systematic inequalities. And what I've heard, in the sessions that I've been part of, is exactly that. I mean, I loved this idea of what is it? Institutionalizing intersectionality, but that we hold the code. We're the makers of the code. Right? So it doesn't matter if Treasury or whomever, or whatever policymakers we're trying to influence, understand the word. The word is about getting to the understanding of where where some of the, I guess, invisible vulnerabilities are in our societies. And if we speak in plain language and we don't use, we work with African women and girls and all their diversity as a cop-out phrase, then what do we do? And I think the creation of the intersectionality framework and its adoption and its integration into the work that we do as a granting organization will absolutely enrich our ability, I think, as a research for development community, to talk more specifically about where change needs to happen, and get away from the broad strokes approach, because we know that doesn't work. In fact, just yesterday, I was listening to an Indigenous Canadian woman talk about the various changes in Canadian law made by lawyers and judges, that those lawyers and judges thought were going to actually help Indigenous people. But because they didn't understand, those lawyers and lawmakers didn't understand the context of Indigenous women in particular in Canada, those various laws that got passed in the last decade have made things worse for them. Worse in an already terrible situation because of a lack of, I think, specificity and an intersectional approach, an intersectional lens to what the problem really is. So I probably missed it. I hope that you have all been talking about, well, what if we don't? What if we don't take an intersectional approach? What are the real consequences? And so we can call it what we want, but really for me, it's about getting to understanding those very specific power dynamics and invisibilities, and putting putting the spotlight there so that policies and implementing policies can actually hit where it's most needed. So what we will do as the center is, of course, take all of the learnings that have come out of these case studies and examine how we as an organization can, first of all, build our own internal capacity in this space, which takes, as I think all of you know that work in an organization ABC, that gender equality, inclusion, intersectionality is a journey. It's not a, take one course for 2 hours and bang, you've checked the box. That is just not the approach. So if you're in an organization, you have to think about regular, discussions about topics like these, not just a once-off. So we have to, as an organization, find ways to make sure that those conversations are happening, that people are engaging, learning, questioning, and then also working and sharing what we've found with the partners that we work with, and vice versa, and learn from them too. And sometimes this work is, I think I've used the word, it's like ant work in a way, because it's little tiny steps, but that over time become something where this is has been institutionalized, right? So I think it's up to our organizations, research for development organizations for sure, to take those little steps to get the to widen the scope of GEI to include an intersectional lens. And we are part of a research for development wider community. So obviously IDRC is not the only organization that grants money for research. And absolutely for sure, we will be advocating for sharing the learnings that have come out of these case studies for that wider audience. We don't want intersectionality to be just a tick box exercise. We have so many tick boxes already on any project that we have to, approve. Samantha will concur with me. Check this, check that, check this, check that. But the intersectional part cannot just be a tick box exercise. It has to influence what questions we ask, how we ask them, and to whom we ask them, etc. I know I'm preaching to the converted. So anyway, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you and to Wits for organizing this incredible 2 days of richness. I know it's being recorded, which is going to be great for us. We're going to be able to share the sessions with a much wider audience. So thanks very much, and all the best for the remaining bits and for the session now.
Thanks to Erin Tanzi for that intervention. It's always good to have these discussions also with, the funders in the room. So I did want to open this up. I mean, there's a lot of organizations that are here that have worked directly on this project, but also experts and additional organizations that have contributed to this discussion. And I did want to kind of pass it over then to you in terms of the role that you think might be important, given the discussions that we've been having for particularly the development funding organizations. So we've had, and I think this might actually bring us into then a conversation around actionable recommendations as well, because the discussions that we've been having have pointed to several issues and also some key considerations even that might relate to this question on the role of grant makers. And so I know, at least from the discussions that we've had today, already issues around kind of resource scarcity, the role of NGOs and civil society, questions around implementation or the challenges for implementation as well, and also various questions that have come about in terms of kind of building solidarity across countries, across sectors, and what that might mean then for you, and what role you think organizations like the IDRC might play in kind of promoting intersectional development research with the aim of addressing the very unique challenges experienced by communities and economies in the Global South. Melody will pass around.
So,
I don't think it's a checklist kind of requirement, but I feel like that going back to the cohort of people you work with could be a requirement for funding projects, that you actually make sure that the data analyzed reflects truthfully what these people actually need. So I feel like most of the time, or a lot of the times, we interpret the data because we are also humans and we have our own subjectivities in a way that ends up recreating the one-size-fits-all framework that we're trying to step away from. So yes, maybe person-centered approaches, maybe on-the-ground research, maybe you'll have like a requirement where you have to talk to people to understand their challenges, and therefore the research could help them or highlight or amplify their voices. But also the component of dissemination and running the data that has been generated back with the people and with the people concerned with the research as a starting point, as interlocutors, as people we kind of derived the data from and then translated it into analytical data or data that has meaning, that this meaning resonates with them. And this should and could be done through other forms of qualitative methods that could make sure that the results or the findings reflect the lived experiences or the ideas and aspirations of the people we're researching, we're talking about, and to.
Is there another question?
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I must say that this was indeed an insightful journey, the past 2 days, and I can't help but recognize how conducive the experiences that the presenters had to undergo in trying to find and analyze circumstances that several countries are dealing with. And to be quite frank, I mean, especially with the situation in Sydney, right? I mean, Syria. I wasn't there, but through how you described the conditions that women are facing that side, I could actually feel myself having to empathize with these women, you know, and even when Dr. Jamal depicted the rural conditions that elderly women face, you know, in terms of the strong belief that they have for the government when it comes to social problems, whatsoever, in the problems that you mentioned in Gambia, and in all those problems being faced, I think it necessitates a strong need for expansion of collaboration, you know, having to expand collaborating with significant partners and significant varying factors in different fields in an effort to truly expand the rootedness of how so or several instances could be concerned. Because even as I observed about the commonalities in your cases about men being perpetrators, you know, and it remains a big question to say, though efforts to raise awareness should indeed be recognized, I still feel that there's a strong need to understand why so much vulgarity among men. Why do they perceive women in some instances to be particular as subject to imposing their respective beliefs, obviously with their cultural perceptions, of course, but that is just an underlying recommendation to say maybe delving into a deeper psychological study, understanding the rootedness of humanity in that regard, you know. I thank you.
I think I have a question that probably I'd want to pose to the director from IDRC, that beyond the intersectionality research project that you know led to the development of the different case studies, how can IDRC be supportive in further supporting intersectional development research beyond the project?
I don't want to abuse the fact that I'm actually holding the microphone. I also had a question, and maybe to also refocus while we still have our colleagues from IDRC online. It's a question and a challenge. I think, Aaron, you mentioned obviously this point on institutionalizing, so I think that also kind of speaks to some points that Matt was asking about. But the question on what if we don't use intersectionality? And I think the conversation in the room has been both, right? So there's the idea that intersectionality, even if it's not how these projects may have been initially approached, that it opens up kind of opportunities for having a broader global discussion on some of the issues that we're speaking about. But it was also raised in these discussions that a lot of the language that we use in development discourse is often appropriated from contexts that are outside of our own lived reality, and that sometimes certain terminology might not apply to the particular cases that we're working in. But then there's a requirement from funders, with a positive outlook on this, there are reasons, and a value, right, to including some of these concepts, inclusive gender frameworks, intersectionality, and they can definitely have value in terms of how we understand some of the issues that we're working with. But sometimes that's not the language that is being used in these contexts, and there are certain instances where communities might reject that, or reject the project on the basis that this does not apply to us. So then from a funder perspective, when this is an interest, right, at a programmatic level, let's say, I think I want to kind of throw it back to the IDRC, not to say, what if we don't use this, but what if organizations that you're working with don't want to use this term, right? How do we continue to do this intersectional work, giving room to communities to kind of identify the realities of their context, right? And I know, at least with the Uyghur case study, one of the things that we were discussing around identity, and also within the context that we're working with, that some organizations or some communities might identify with, as just generally as workers. But given the context, we know what that means, right? We know that even in the case, for example, of South Africa, that it is Black women that are more likely to be in precarious or unstable jobs. So certain kind of marginalizations and discrimination is implied even in our identification as workers. And that is the term that we feel helps us to build solidarity within this particular context. And so, yeah, what do we do then with that situation, and what is the reaction from funders in continuing to support this work where there might be resistance from the organizations on the ground who don't want to use that? And then a second question was around institutionalizing this. Another issue that's been raised is, and it's an issue that's been raised here, but I think it's a general issue when you speak about issues of society, of gender, of intersectionality, where a lot of these issues either get sidelined under certain, this is the gender program that's interested in intersectionality, or or this idea of feminist economics being quote-unquote kitchen economics. We all know the women are going to be there. All other programs don't have to incorporate this. It's a completely separate thing. So how do we ensure that this is something that happens across projects, even those that do not regard themselves as, working on particular issues at a community level? I think the last panel kind of pointed out that these things that we might not think apply on the ground are actually have real implications for the communities and the individuals that are involved. So how do we institutionalize this across projects, but also in how we kind of create funding for certain spaces? So at a funding level as well, what does intersectional grant making look like? Because we know what it means, like at a programmatic level, but now we're deciding which projects to fund, which contexts. How does that happen? I understand, Aaron, that's a big question for you to resolve, but any thoughts would be appreciated. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Erin, for the presentation. So I just wanted to come in as like a former M&E person, someone who's actually done monitoring and evaluation. And, I hear like you talking about, which is also something that I think resonates with a lot of us, that this work, if you think about intersectionality, it is end work. So like you think about social change being long-term. And I just wanted to ask, like, how can we think about, the reporting requirements and us reporting in a way that integrates intersectionality? I'm just reminded about a comment that Nicole made when she was presenting about, grant makers are not concerned or are not so interested about feelings. They want the numbers. So like, how do we think about, if we are talking about outcomes and outputs, how do we now like start to shift in the way that, the kind of requirements that a grant maker might have, or the kind of, expectations, I'd say, a grant maker might have, towards an organization that is kind of doing this work, and that organization maybe not being able to fully articulate the complexities, or maybe, like, I remember a case that we had with the Dutch ministry, and they were saying, but case studies are not rigor, like it's not a rigorous way of, and then you think, but like, I thought you wanted the nuances. So like, how do you balance, those, like, when it comes to reporting and the reporting requirements? I hope I wasn't long-winded. Thank you.
So yeah, at a programmatic level, what do you think? What do you think the implications of some of the questions that have been raised in the room might be, or the challenges, given the work that you do?
I mean, see, it's just online before I give it a go. Justin might be better positioned to ask this her role in the organization, if that's okay. So I might put Justin on the spot, and I can compliment it if that's all right.
Hi, everyone. I think I heard that. I think Samantha passed the football to me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I'm just joining for this session. I wish I could have been there for the earlier ones, although I did attend a session yesterday and found it really fascinating. I think the questions that have been posed so far, pardon me, have been really excellent and really get to the heart of the sort of the complexity and the messiness of how to, quote unquote, operationalize intersectional approaches and intersectionality. When I was reading through the synthesis report, a couple of things jumped out at me that I think a lot of folks in the room already have touched on. So firstly, the emphasis on power analysis and understanding that as a funder, specifically a Canadian funder, Canadian public funder, I can definitely put my video on. I wasn't able to before. If one of the admins could just turn my video on, I'd be happy to have that as an aid. I'm not able to do it on my end. But what does it mean in terms of our positionality as a Canadian Northern-based public funder of research for development in terms of power? We can attempt to flatten these hierarchies, but it's baked into the pie. We receive the money. We're responsible for, dispersing and supporting and working with and alongside and accompanying grantees in the work that they do. But inevitably, I don't know how close we can get to that flattening relationship, or that truly equal relationship. It's something that I really don't have the answer to. But I really appreciate this call to apply a power analysis to the ways in which we work, which I think there's a lot of room for movement in terms of that. I really appreciate the point that was raised, I think the first question, and apologies, I didn't catch your name, around validating research results, going back to research constituents, participants, folks that will be impacted or use the research, and make sure that what grantees have found really resonates and makes sense. And I think we're doing this in a lot of ways. Forgive me, I'm relatively new to IDRC and I don't work directly on projects, so perhaps Samantha can come in and fill in some of the color there on some details. But I know, for example, there are some funds that are often allocated towards things like inception workshops, making sure that at the outset of a research project that IDRC funds and sets aside specific money and resources to bring together all the partners on a research grant, whether that be universities, the PIs, but then also oftentimes civil society organizations that are partners, women's rights organizations, other CBOs, women's rights defenders, and other folks working in more of a civil society space who are brought along, not in a passive way, but are very much active and something towards equitable partners in the research, to make sure that the design and set out the process of how these things will be validated all throughout the research cycle. And perhaps Samantha has some details about sort of what happens at the end in terms of the validation. But I have heard some examples around that. And I think something else that the synthesis report and also some of these comments point to is the trickiness of, as I said, this operationalization, which is who do we fund? And we can't just say, we're funding, women's, a team of, predominantly women researchers, or there's 50% women on the research team. That doesn't really cut it. That doesn't get to the heart of the matter. It doesn't interrogate and remake power structures. How do we fund? So these questions of how do we move away from this tick box compliance approach to we're doing it because we're told to, or we're doing it because we said that we would, and here's the box that says that we did it, into something that's much more meaningful. And perhaps our systems aren't, well, I think I know, the systems currently, I don't think are equipped for that. So I would be really interested to hear from others in the room who have had examples of things, of maybe partnerships they've had that have done this really well, that have maybe allowed for some of those more qualitative, nuanced pieces. I'm sorry to hear that case studies aren't considered by some as valid and rigorous and quality research. I, as a qualitative researcher, have a very different opinion. But I think it, again, just points to that messiness. And then the last thing, I talked about the who we fund and the how we fund. And then, of course, the what we fund. Are we just doing, or, of course, we feed into, and we're, our priorities are reflective of many things, including agendas. But I appreciate the point in the report that says, as a funder, albeit perhaps a small fish in a large pond of funders, we do wield some power and influence. And how can we work with like-minded funders and donors to really, learn and go along in this journey with our grantees and really learn from, where a lot of this thinking and learning is coming from, which is most often not, from our office in Ottawa, although we have wonderful colleagues who come with vast experience and situated experience and knowledge. But it's oftentimes from our partners and our grantees. I'll stop there, and I'm hoping that Samantha can pick up on some of these things and sort of fill in, as I said, the color of some of the details from a programming perspective. So Sam, I'll kick that to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Just to touch on the data validation piece quickly, and to give an example of it. I mean, I definitely think it's best practice in terms of validating the research, but earlier today I was with colleagues at WITS in the public health unit, and we were talking about, they're doing a kind of research around restricting marketing to children of unhealthy foods as a public health kind of policy. And so we were talking about how do we validate the data when we're working with children and youth, and as researchers used to kind of typing out qualitative and quantitative data that suits a more technical audience. And so we were talking about kind of creative or different ways of validating the data through creating a comic book or a youth-friendly policy brief. But I think it's certainly best practice and something that's necessary before going through the process of even starting to think about knowledge translation and how the research that's collected and kind of ready and primed to be for use can then be promoted or shared with knowledge users. I don't think, I think in the absence of that data validation, it's not ready to be, positioned for use. So it's certainly best practice. How widely it's used across the center is a question, and sometimes with audiences that are more vulnerable or subjects that are more vulnerable, it's hard to go through that data validation process. And I know for colleagues who are working in conflict-driven zones, they sometimes have difficulty with that, but it's certainly something that we strive for.
Okay. Hi, Jessica. We can see you. We can see you now. Hi. You can go.
Question actually raised from this conversation on validation, not related to validation at all, although that is definitely a part of a lot of the projects that we work on. Another question that has, an issue that has come up in terms of intersectionality and development research, I think yesterday as well, was around dissemination. And I think a lot of the time, this question on dissemination is answered from, I think, the grantee perspective. And I just, as you were speaking, I was wondering, what is the dissemination strategy from IDRC side, or is it kind of funding based, where you have dissemination as part of the project, or are there specific ways in which you think that intersectionality can be applied for your own dissemination strategies?
So at the beginning of even conceptualizing a research idea, working with partners, knowledge translation is very much at the forefront. So Jessica mentioned these inception workshops where we come together at the beginning and kind of visualize the whole research project cycle. And knowledge translation is a huge part of that. And so in that case, best practice is co-creation with knowledge users. So having the people who will ultimately need and use that knowledge and the evidence as part of the research process as partners. So that will vary depending on the audience of the research, but I think increasingly IDRC is striving to have knowledge users as a part of the partnership or as part of the project, as being those who will understand the research best in some cases, and have use for it and be able to use it to drive change. It's a bit of a generic answer, but it's certainly an important part of the research process and increasingly becoming a requirement. Jess, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that covers it.
Hello. So I think there's a problem that lies within kind of thinking whether the funder or the funded should do the dissemination, because sometimes it's very context related and sometimes we have to do the hard work of translating, localizing, boiling down, moving away from big words and big theories and big ideas and just go talk to people. So I think that yes, it falls under the category of dissemination or knowledge translation plans, which I honestly value IDRC for, because I've been working for IDRC funded projects for over 3 years now, and even the project I'm currently on has a big component on it being person-centered. At least it doesn't call itself intersectional, but it calls itself person-centered, which is quite the same thing, more or less. So I think that it has to be back to the word collaboration between the funder, necessitating and highlighting the importance of people being part of the final product, for lack of a better word, but also for the researchers and us ourselves being responsible for making sure that we, because we are from the context and we're catering for the context, that we have the best practices to also get back to the donor with on some level. I don't think that if we just put the responsibility on funders, be it IDRC or anyone else, it's going to, I think, recreate the one-size-fits-all. This is what knowledge translation plans look like, and this is what you're supposed to do, and maybe your community or the people you worked with do not see it as well, or do not want this or want something else.
Listen.
Yeah.
Jessica? Would you like to say something?
No, I was mostly nodding in agreement. Yeah, I appreciate that recognition of the various roles, you know, that we all play in this sort of this partnership, the funder. I think that's absolutely valid. I don't think that we're, you know, best positioned to understand local contexts in many places. In most situations, you know, researchers and even, you know, in instances where researchers are partnering with, as I said, you know, like community-based organizations, women's rights organizations, and other folks that are maybe from civil society working hand in hand. And as Sam said, you know, working with knowledge users themselves to sort of create these or co-create, you know, knowledge translation products, whether it be that super innovative idea of a comic book or whether it's a radio show or, you know, however people, you know, best absorb, use, interact with, and then hopefully, you know, apply information and research outcomes. I see my colleague Tanda has her hand up there.
Yeah, Nomtandazo, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I can unmute myself now, but I'm not sure you can see me. I can't turn my video on, but I was just going to echo what Jessica and Samantha said, and I think, you know, the knowledge translation bit, and I think what's really important about it as well is that from the equity perspective, you know, when you think about what Samantha talked about in terms of the idea of designing and co-creating research agendas and plans and projects in partnership with not just knowledge users, but the ultimate beneficiaries of the research. So community level actors and communities and people who will benefit from the research. What it means to co-create these agendas and projects and ideas with beneficiaries or the ultimate users of the research, it also, from an equity perspective, is hugely important because it does sort of bring community level actors and users and others into the research process. And I think that's important, not just from an evidence use perspective, but from an equity perspective as well, in that co-creation piece is valuable as a means of addressing some of the power dynamics inherent in the research process. So just wanted to underscore that it's valuable from the knowledge translation, evidence use, and promoting the use of research, but also valuable for, I think, redressing some of those power inequalities and bringing diverse voices and perspectives into the research process itself.
Thanks to all of you, Nomtanda, Zo, Jessica, and Samantha, who's in the room with us. Just as a final question, I think in kind of bringing us now to this next session around recommendations, and this is, it's both a question but also a prompt from your side. What are the challenges do you see in terms of kind of integrating intersectionality in the work that you do? And I think you can only speak from a programmatic level, given the work that you're doing. And yeah, so that if we're able to come up with some recommendations in this room, are there any challenges that you see in implementing this?
I mean, I work in our climate resilient food systems program, so I can probably speak from that angle more. But I think, you know, when we look at research proposals and projects, often people who work in the food system space aren't thinking about intersectionality first and foremost when they're thinking about how to create healthier environments, but it's a huge component of it. And I think IDRC increasingly trying to include it in its requirements for how projects are assessed and looked at is an important piece of the assessment process. The way in which people interact with food is incredibly gendered, you know, as is the way in which people are marketed food, access it, the role that they have in the home. So I think at least from that perspective, though it may be slightly less relevant to kind of this group in the room, it's an integral part of the assessment process that IDRC undertakes. Jess, Tando, I'm not sure if either of you have something to add.
Yeah, I can jump in. And to connect back to the synthesis report, another theme that really jumped out at me was this call for self-reflection. And I think self-reflection happens at a couple of different levels. Firstly, perhaps in no particular order, maybe not firstly, but one is at the individual level. So thinking about who you are, your role within this like larger ecosystem, within a research project, whatever it is, within the issue, your experience with it, and thinking about sort of how you show up and what role there is to contribute there in terms of thinking of and including intersectionality, but really thinking about one's own positionality. And then, of course, institutionally, organizationally, you know, really having that self-reflection. And as I mentioned, I'm relatively new to IDRC, but what has been really heartening is that despite the overall, I think it's a quite mammoth challenge of how to think about, and you know, I keep saying operationalize, but I don't love that word, but the best way I can think about it is like implementing or incorporating or integrating intersectional approaches in the way that we work, is just the number of times it's raised in conversations that I've been having and that I've been privy to have at the center level. It's raised, I would say, you know, in like 80% of the conversations, no matter what it's around, no matter which kind of program it is, no matter what level of operations, people are really craving guidance and tools of how to do intersectionality. And I use sort of air quotes around the do intersectionality piece. And I think that is a real shift from, you know, and I think something to be recognized. We have a long way to go, certainly, and I think that's part of the challenge, because it is not a one size fits all, because there's no concrete, you know, templates or tools to just, you know, plug and go. Because it's so contextually specific, not to mention the sort of debates that are, you know, within intersectional thinkers and thinkers around intersectionality. So how do we apply that, you know, to a funder like IDRC? And I think maybe I'll just offer, you know, this self-reflection piece. I see it also popping up in things like Sam mentioned, she's part of the Climate Resilient Food Systems program, one of 5 programs that we have. And there's a really strong gender equality and inclusion task force within that large program of colleagues. And they've adopted a learning block of 6 months. They've given themselves 6 months within that program to just talk about intersectionality. What does it mean for each program? What does it mean for how they work with grantees? What does it mean for the types of research that they're funding? What does it mean for themselves? What kind of reading do they need to do? What kind of capacity strengthening needs to happen at the center level? And so that really excites me from my perspective. But it also points to sort of where along the journey we are. I think we're quite early, but I think we've already started making some progress, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So in terms of challenges, I think they are huge and numerous. And I would be, again, just really open and appreciative of any suggestions or experiences that other folks in the room have that we can learn from and sort of think about how to apply it at IDRC.
Thanks again to our colleagues at the IDRC for all of your interventions. I think they're going to help us think more clearly about some of the actionable recommendations that can be proposed based on this workshop, but also on the broader project. Thank you.